Today we begin the first of two podcasts on Chinese philosophy. We will be looking at the philosophy of the Taoist sage Chuang Tzu, who lived 3 centuries before the birth of Christ, so roughly contemporary with Socrates. This week you will have read the introduction by Thomas Merton to The Way of Chuang Tzu, which is a collection of Thomas Merton's translations of Taoist texts. These texts are all attributed to Chuang Tzu himself, who was a writer and a poet. I want to say a little bit first about Thomas Merton, and then introduce in general Eastern philosophy as a tradition quite distinct from Western philosophy, before we look in detail at the context of Taoism. Thomas Merton was a 20th century American writer who had a dramatic conversion to Catholicism. Not only did he leave behind atheism and a secular lifestyle and embrace Roman Catholicism, he entered one of the strictest religious orders in the Catholic Church in the 40s. He became a Cistercian monk. The Cistercians are a contemplative order. That means that unlike, for example, the Franciscans, whom you might have heard of, the Cistercians dedicate their lives to prayer, to silence. When Merton entered this order, he essentially left the world. In those days, the Cistercians took vows of silence. They only spoke to each other when necessary and used sign language to do so. The life of a Cistercian monk was a life dedicated to chanting the Psalms, to studying the Scriptures, and to solitude. Thomas Merton, therefore, is a contemplative in the Western tradition, but he also had a keen interest in Eastern contemplative practices. Western philosophy is often contrasted with Eastern philosophy. Western philosophy is more rationalistic, materialistic, and dualistic, and Eastern philosophy is more spiritual and religious. While there is some truth to this claim, it is, like most generalizations, more false than true. There certainly are rationalists and materialists and dualists in the Western tradition, but there are also contemplatives and non-dualists and mystics in the Western tradition. Indeed, Socrates himself, as we've seen, displays some of these mystical and non-dualist qualities. And similarly, there are rationalists and materialists and dualists among the Eastern philosophers. However, there is one point which is worth underscoring. In Eastern philosophy, philosophy remained closely connected to religion, whether that be traditional Chinese religion, which is Confucianism, or traditional Japanese religion, such as Shinto, or traditional Indian religion, such as Hinduism and Buddhism. Whereas in the West, philosophy developed independently to some degree of religion, or at least understood itself to be distinct from religion. In fact, we can see that Socrates is working very hard to separate, in some respects, the practice of philosophy from the practice of religion or the teaching of the poets, i.e., from mythological polytheism. There are two central currents of Eastern philosophy which have reached the modern world. One is yoga, which comes out of India, and the other is Zen, which comes out of Japan. And we will talk more about Zen as the semester progresses. Both of these spiritual practices have their roots deep in Eastern religious philosophies. Yoga comes out of India and ancient Indian philosophy, and Zen comes out of Buddhism, especially Japanese Buddhism, which, as we shall see, has specific differences from other forms of Buddhism. Japanese Buddhism seems to have blended traditional Chinese Taoism with Buddhist teachings out of India. So when we speak about Taoism, we're speaking about one of the traditional philosophical schools of China, and we're speaking about one of the central ingredients in the Zen tradition. So you'll notice various similarities between what Chuang Tzu says and what we'll learn about Zen later on. A central concern of Chuang Tzu is the problem of dualism. And by dualism, we mean that form of thought which splits reality into two incommensurable sides, like body and soul in Socrates, or mind and matter in the modern world. And we also mean any approach to questions concerning truth which one-sidedly clings to one aspect of a phenomena to the exclusion of the other. What Chuang Tzu, like other Eastern sages, teaches is a form of non-dualism, refusing to take sides on fundamental issues, refusing to divide the world into two different kinds of things, whether that's a mind and matter or body and soul. The non-dualists emphasize the primordial unity of being. These differences between things, these distinctions which become so important in later philosophy, these are all surface. At the depths, reality is one. But the oneness of reality, according to non-dualist thinkers, cannot easily be expressed. When we express anything, when we articulate a truth claim, we invariably implicate ourselves in dualistic ways of thinking. So non-dualism eludes expression or direct language. The truth is only pointed to indirectly. And this is why Chuang Tzu will use such peculiar paradoxical statements, why he'll speak in such a playful way. This is also why in the Zen tradition we will get the apparent irrationalism of Zen, the koans, and the paradoxes and puzzles of the Zen masters. It's not that the Zen teachers or Chuang Tzu are deliberately trying to be irrational. What they are trying to do is they are trying to frustrate a certain average understanding of things which depends upon duality, separation, and distinction. A familiar symbol for non-duality is yin-yang. Yin-yang refers to the two sides of every reality and the two sides of reality itself. Yin and yang are in every way opposites, but these opposites depend upon each other, and one is never found without the other. Yin is dark, yang is bright. Yin is negative, yang is positive. Yin is receptive, yang is active. Yin is winter, yang is summer. Yin is female, yang is male. Reality is always found in a play of opposites. Reality is always found bifurcated and divided between these two apparently exclusive sides. Now, we've said that this is a doctrine of non-duality, but at the center here we see a duality. There are two. There is yin and there is yang. Wouldn't non-duality be void of all distinction whatsoever? This is an important question. It seems that non-duality is not the denial of distinctions and differences as such, it's rather the denial of the exclusion of differences. That is, non-duality affirms the contradictory nature of things and the way that opposites implicate each other, the way that night invariably follows day, the way that the negative is really defined in terms of the positive. So it isn't that there are not different things or distinctions or opposites at play. It's rather that these opposites are to be understood as implicating each other, as belonging together in a unity. And it's that unity which is so crucial. The unity is what Chuang Tzu calls Tao. Tao is an untranslatable word. Perhaps the best translation is the way. But even then, we somehow miss many of the overtones of the term. The Tao is being. The Tao is reality. The Tao is the structure of things. The Tao is the way of nature. When Chuang Tzu appeared on the scene, Taoism was already old. Ancient Chinese philosophy was divided up into a number of schools. There was, first of all, Confucianism. Opposed to this was Mohism. All of these ancient Chinese philosophies centered on the question of the good. The fundamental issue for Chinese philosophy is what ought people to do? How is it best to live? Confucius taught that the best way to live is to live a life of duty, that is, to obey tradition. And one's duties are determined by one's position in society. So the best thing for a husband to do is to love his wife. The best thing for a son to do is to obey his parents. The best thing for the king to do is to treat his subjects well. In each case, there is a kind of natural morality bound up with the variety of social situations that human beings find themselves in. We ought to obey tradition, and when we do so, we will find ourselves living in a harmonious society. Turn to page 17 of Merton's introductory essay to the Way of Chuang Tzu. The classic Jew philosophy of Confucius and his followers can be called a traditional personalism built on the basic social relationships and obligations that are essential to a humane life, and that, when carried out as they should be, develop the human potentialities of each person in his relation to others. In fulfilling the commands of nature as manifested by tradition, which are essentially commands of love, man develops his own inner potential for love, understanding, reverence, and wisdom. He becomes a superior man or a noble-minded man, fully in harmony with heaven, earth, his sovereign, his parents and children, and his fellow men, by his obedience to Tao. End quote. You'll see here that the Confucians also used the word Tao, but what they meant by Tao is moral duty, what one ought to do given one's position in society. Mohism took the opposite view. Mohism argued that impartial love was higher than this loving one's own, which Confucius taught. Impartial love is universal love, love for anyone regardless of their relation to you. It is in some respects a version of Christian love. Only the Mohists seem to have arrived at the doctrine of universal love through strict argumentation. They argue that it is best for society to be peopled by individuals who are not driven by their allegiance to family and state and ethnic group, but rather are committed to loving all people equally. Chuang Tzu does not offer a third philosophy to compete with these two. He doesn't say, no, I have a third way, which is better than the way of Confucius or the way of the Mohists. He rather says that these two opposites really belong together in some respects, and therefore the way is neither Confucian nor Mohist. The neither nor structure of that argument is central to non-dual thought. The Tao is the way of nature. It's not the way of tradition, but sometimes the way of nature coincides with the way of tradition. The Tao also is not incompatible with the kind of universal love that the Mohists were teaching, but it doesn't emphasize this universal love at the expense of family love or social duty. It might be helpful here to turn to one of the texts of Chuang Tzu to illustrate this somewhat difficult point. Turn to page 42 of The Way of Chuang Tzu, this little section called The Pivot. Tao is obscured when men understand only one of a pair of opposites, or concentrate only on a partial aspect of being. Then clear expression also becomes muddled by mere wordplay, affirming this one aspect and denying all the rest. Hence the wrangling of Confucians and Mohists. Each denies what the other affirms, and affirms what the other denies. What use is this struggle to set up no against yes, and yes against no? Better to abandon this hopeless effort and seek true light. There is nothing that cannot be seen from the standpoint of the not I, and there is nothing which cannot be seen from the standpoint of the I. If I begin by looking at anything from the viewpoint of the not I, then I do not really see it, since it is not I that sees it. If I begin from where I am and see it as I see it, then it may also become possible for me to see it as another sees it. Hence the theory of reversal, that opposites produce each other, depend on each other, and complement each other. However this may be, life is followed by death, death is followed by life. The possible becomes impossible, the impossible becomes possible. Right turns into wrong, and wrong into right. The flow of life alters circumstances, and thus things themselves are altered in their turn. But disputants continue to affirm and to deny the same things they've always affirmed and denied, ignoring the new aspects of reality presented by the change in conditions. The wise man, therefore, instead of trying to prove this or that point by logical disputation, sees all things in the light of direct intuition. He is not imprisoned by the limitations of the I, for the viewpoint of direct intuition is that of both I and not I. Hence he sees that on both sides of every argument there is both right and wrong. He also sees that in the end they are reducible to the same thing, once they are related to the pivot of Tao. When the wise man grasps this pivot, he is in the center of the circle, and there he stands while yes and no pursue each other round the circumference. The pivot of Tao passes through the center, where all affirmations and denials converge. He who grasps the pivot is at the still point, from which all movements and oppositions can be seen in their right relationship. Hence he sees the limitless possibilities of both yes and no. Abandoning all thought of imposing a limit or taking sides, he rests in direct intuition. Therefore, I said, better to abandon disputation and seek the true light. End quote. The Taoist doesn't take a position. Rather, the Taoist rests between all positions, in the still point at the center of all opposition, the still point at the center of all movement. And from this place of non-positionality, from this, the Taoist is able to see everything as it is. He sees all of the possibilities on the one side, the yes side. He sees all the possibilities on the other side, the no side. This is referred to as being a position that's neither I nor not I. In other words, the Taoist does not assert their ego by taking a position over and against other positions which other egos might assert. So the Taoist does not assert themselves against others, but neither does the Taoist deny themselves and take the positions endorsed by other people. The Taoist rather assumes this middle place between I and not I, between ego and other. And from this center place, they are able to understand how all of these various positions have produced each other, how they depend upon each other, how they complement each other, how no one could be entirely true, and that to take one side for the absolute truth is to assert a falsehood. And for this reason, the Taoists said that the highest truth cannot be expressed whatsoever. They drew a distinction between the Tao that can be named and the Tao that cannot be named. The Tao that can be named they called the mother of the 10,000 things. The Tao that cannot be named they called the eternal Tao. It was nameless and unknowable, the deep source of everything. It was this eternal Tao that was fundamentally drawing the Taoist sage away from any one-sided philosophy or any one-sided commitment to a social or political position. Now, one might be inclined to conclude that Taoism is an amoralism, that Taoism denies that there is anything really good or really bad. And I think this would be a mistake. I think Thomas Merton is very wise to this mistake. He sees clearly that Taoism is not concerned so much with letting us do whatever we want as it is with encouraging us to find our authentic truth, to find the good that only we can do, to follow our inner law rather than some external law or some social code. Turn to page 23 of Merton's introduction. Here Merton is discussing doing the good from some egocentric place of wanting to make oneself into a good person. For the Taoist, this is entirely wrong-headed and even immoral. I'll read now from Merton. The more one seeks the good outside oneself as something to be acquired, the more one is faced with the necessity of discussing, studying, understanding, analyzing the nature of the good. The more, therefore, one becomes involved in abstractions and in the confusion of divergent opinions. The more the good is objectively analyzed, the more it is treated as something to be attained by special virtuous techniques, the less real it becomes. As it becomes less real, it recedes further into the distance of abstraction, futurity, unattainability. The more, therefore, one concentrates on the means to be used to attain it. And as the end becomes more remote and more difficult, the means becomes more elaborate and complex, until finally the mere study of the means becomes so demanding that all one's effort must be concentrated on this, and the end is forgotten. The way of Tao is to begin with the simple good, with which one is endowed by the very fact of existence, instead of self-conscious cultivation of this good, which vanishes when we look at it and becomes intangible when we try to grasp it. We grow quietly in the humility of a simple, ordinary life. So the point is to do nothing. And this is the concept of Wu Wei, non-action. The Taoist does nothing, and nothing is left undone. The Taoist achieves everything by trying to achieve nothing. This is highly paradoxical, and I don't expect you to understand it on first hearing it. One needs to sit with these texts, reflect on them, allow them to sink into one's soul before one can get a glimmer of light. It is the way of ceasing to impose oneself on the world through a course of action, and rather letting things take their course. The Confucian tries to do good and ends up imposing themselves on nature. The Taoist does nothing, and nature takes its course. When nature is allowed to take its course, nothing remains to be done, and everything is as it should be. Turn now to page 24 of the Merton text. The secret of the way proposed by Chuang Tzu is therefore not the accumulation of virtue and merit taught by Tzu, but Wu Wei, the non-doing or non-action, which is not intent upon results, and is not concerned with consciously laid plans or deliberately organized endeavors. My greatest happiness consists precisely in doing nothing whatever that is calculated to obtain happiness. Perfect joy is to be without joy. If you ask what ought to be done and what ought not to be done on earth to produce happiness, I answer that these questions do not have a fixed and predetermined answer to suit every case. If one is in harmony with Tao, the cosmic Tao, great Tao, the answer will make itself clear when the time comes to act. For then, one will act not according to the human and self-conscious mode of deliberation, but according to the divine and spontaneous mode of Wu Wei, which is the mode of action of Tao itself, and is therefore the source of all good. End quote. To follow the Tao, then, is to spontaneously act out of one's deepest nature, not to reflect and plan and formulate rules, not to look around at the external order to make sure one's actions are in conformity with them, but to be oneself, the little thing that you are, the clod of earth, and to act out of that place of humility as one is equipped to act by nature. And when one acts this way, the Taoist believes that nothing will be left undone which ought to be done. Everything will be as it should be.